Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone around the world, and welcome to Cultural Intellectual Property Rights and the Rights of Nature, an event developed with love and dedication by Fashion Revolution in partnership with the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative. My name is Monica Boța-Moisin. I am a lawyer and a cultural sustainability consultant, and I will be your host today for the next 90 minutes. This year's Fashion Revolution theme, rights, relationships, revolution, is the perfect opportunity for us to talk about how do Indigenous and local communities protect the textile cultural expressions and conserve biodiversity. Joining me on today's panel are three amazing individuals, inspiring individuals that amplify the voices of Indigenous people, local communities, and ethnic groups around the world. They represent them proudly today, and I will take a tour around the globe to introduce them to you. First up in Laos to meet Tara Gujadur, co-director of the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center in Laos and representative of the Oma ethnic group of Nanam village in Laos. TAC is a member of the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative since 2019. Welcome, Tara.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Next up, we go to Sweden, where we're meeting Rebecca Forsgren, member of the Sami indigenous people and project leader at Min Oda Giron in Sweden. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Really nice to let me have this opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And last stop, but not least, we're going to India, to Assam, to meet Rituraj Devan, co-founder of Seven Weaves and member of the indigenous communities of Assam in India. Welcome, Ritu.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning, everybody. It's an exciting day.
From this conversation today with Tara, Rebecca, and Rituraj, the fashion industry can learn about the importance of valuing traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions and get practical information on how to develop collaborations with craftspeople and indigenous communities based on equity, dignity, and benefit sharing. So before we meet the panelists, in my capacity as founder of the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative, I would like to take you on a short journey into the world of cultural intellectual property rights and the rights of nature. Culture, nature, and textiles are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent. This is particularly evident in the relationship between Indigenous and local communities and their traditional textiles and textile manufacturing techniques. The principle of design to minimize waste, mindful use of resources in tune with the regeneration cycles, and emotional connection with garments are just a few of the principles that are the basis of the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation in Indigenous communities and local communities. To bridge this gap between fashion and traditional knowledge, the mission of the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative is to act as a mediator between the interests of fashion businesses and those of artisans and traditional creative communities around the world. The Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative was founded in 2018 on the 26th of April. So we will be turning three just a few days from now, 3 years old. With the need or from the need to eliminate culturally appropriated behavior in the fashion industry, meaning misappropriation, stopping misappropriation and unfair commercial use of elements that represent important identity representations of communities around the world. Our team is small, but very dedicated. We have a team spread across 4 continents at the moment in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Australia. The main problem that we tackle is the lack of adequate legislation to protect traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. The conventional intellectual property law system does not offer legal tools at an international level to support these communities to respond to cases of misuse and misappropriation. So what we do is we advocate for the development of a new type of protection, a sui generis legislation system for the protection of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. We refer to this system as cultural intellectual property rights, a new generation of rights that would ensure protection against misappropriation and misuse. Another way in which we accomplish our mission is by developing tools that translate the legal language, sometimes we call it legalese, to the fashion businesses and fashion stakeholders. We want to guide best practices and enable cultural sustainability in fashion. One such tool is the 3 C's rule: consent, credit, and compensation. You might be familiar with this rule from our 3 C's Get Weaving campaign, a campaign that we launched last year and that we aim to translate in as many languages as possible to spread this knowledge across the globe. The 3 C's stand for consent, free, prior, and informed consent; credit, acknowledgement of the source community and the inspiration; and compensation, that can be monetary or non-monetary. The 3 C's rule is applicable whether we are talking about the use of traditional designs and techniques or natural resources. And before we move on to meet and hear from our amazing panelists, there are 2 concepts that I would like to introduce as well. They will be mentioned a lot today. The first is that of traditional knowledge. Defined by the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization as a living body of knowledge consisting of know-how, skills, and practices that are passed on from generation to generation in a community, traditional knowledge is an incredible source of inspiration and wisdom that can be integrated in contemporary society. Secondly, traditional cultural expressions are those tangible or intangible expressions that embody traditional knowledge. The tangible ones consist of cultural practices, signs, symbols, names, musical expressions, and even lifestyles. Tangible expressions are those that we can touch and feel and very much replicated by the fashion industry when creating collections inspired from indigenous designs. These are jewelry, garments, traditional instruments, woodwork, all kinds of textiles, and even architectural forms. When referring to traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, it's important to know that traditional doesn't mean old, lost in time. It equals cultural continuity. It expresses a long-term link with a community, meaning that this knowledge is developed, sustained, and passed on within a community, often being part of their cultural and spiritual identity. Now, with this short intro, I would like to invite you to follow our Instagram and check our website for more information about the work we do at the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative, and get to the most important part of the day, meeting our panelists. So I will now give the floor to Tara in Laos to talk to us about the traditional textile design database of the OMA of Laos. Thank you, Tara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to Monica and to CIPRI, as well as Fashion Revolution, for hosting this webinar today. My name is Tara Gujadar. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center here in Luang Prabang, Laos. Just to start, to tell you a little bit about TAC, we are a cultural heritage social enterprise. We were started in 2007 to promote more understanding and appreciation of the cultural diversity of Laos and to promote sustainable livelihoods development. We run a museum, we do research, we do cultural events and education and outreach activities, but we also have a very large handicrafts program. We currently work with over 600 handicraft producers throughout the country, primarily rural ethnic minority women who are the poorest population in the country. We work with them on training, we do product development together, logistics, and we sell their products in our shops, both here in town as well as online. And 50% of the income from our shops goes directly back to our artisans. Next slide, please. So our foray into cultural intellectual property rights came in 2019. The Oma ethnic group, with whom we've been working for over 10 years now, was plagiarized by Max Mara, an Italian fashion brand. So I have a short video that can sum up the issue. Okay, thank you. So what did we learn from this experience? Well, first, we learned that a lot of companies will refuse to admit any wrongdoing, like Max Mara. And many times fashion companies like to claim inspiration. And this is very much part of fashion's history of being based on a model that doesn't value the work of traditional artisans that are working in non-traditional contexts. And so This is a major problem because fashion brands rely on the law. So unfortunately, there is still no international framework to protect traditional cultural expressions. And so this leaves traditional designs open to misuse and to misappropriation. Next slide, please. We were lucky enough, TAC, to partner with SIPRI and the Oma of Nanam village to secure funding from the Voice program to start to work on developing a model to protect traditional cultural expressions. So the first step that we took was going to the Oma, specifically of Nanam village, the largest Oma community in Laos, and having some very in-depth discussions about the issue. We had focus group discussions with youth, with artisans, with village elders, with leadership, to ensure that we had their free, prior, informed consent and their true partnership in developing this model and documenting their traditional cultural expressions. The next thing that we did was very in-depth research, a lot of interviews, a lot of time spent with artisans to document their motifs, the cultural context of their textiles, the meaning and significance, the materials used, and of course, a lot of photographs and videos as well. And then with that, we were able to create a traditional textile design database. You can see the next slide here shows what it looks like. We're actually in the process of uploading this to the internet now. However, not all of it will be visible to the public. It will actually be password protected because it is the intellectual property of the Oma and will require their consent in order for people to be able to have access to all of it. However, we really see this as a repository. The Oma see this as a repository for their cultural heritage, but then also an invitation to collaborate with designers who really want to partner with them and really develop designs together. For the Oma, it is simply important that they are involved in the process. Finally, this database would also provide some sort of defensive evidence in the case that they are misappropriated again. This database itself will be copyrighted, and it will have an opportunity then that if there is a problem, this will be able to demonstrate that these motifs, these designs, these textiles really have been under the custodianship of the Oma for a very long time. I'll leave you with my last slide, which is simply a question that I wanted to throw out to the group here that I hope that we can get into a discussion about later in this session of how we can encourage the fashion sector to value the skills and knowledge of traditional artisans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Tara, for this compelling and amazing presentation of the work you do in Laos and for asking this question, a very important question for the entire audience today. Why do we value knowledge differently? Why is the IP system unequal? Why do we treat in the fashion industry creators in an unequal manner? Moving on from Laos to Sweden to hear from Rebecca about the Sami indigenous people and the importance of free, prior, and informed consent. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you all for inviting me to take part of this panel and to be part of this discussion, which is about a subject that is extremely important and of great interest to me and many others. Yes, as I've said, my name is Rebecca Forsgren. I'm a Sami, I'm a lawyer and an activist for indigenous people's rights. I have worked in the UN specialized agency on intellectual property, so the World Intellectual Property Organization, with questions about how to protect traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. I am now working with strengthening Sami participatory rights, and I take part in the planning of cooperation between the Nordic countries about how we can protect Sami and Inuit traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. So my people, the Sami, we're divided through colonization by 4 states. So it's Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. Still, we are one people. So we share our cultural expressions. So these are spread out throughout these countries. our expressions vary. We make knives, belts, bags, we make our traditional clothes, which in Southern Sami, my language, is called gapta, and much more. Much of the materials that we use, and then therefore the shapes and designs, it comes from the possibility that nature provides, and especially the possibility that the reindeer provides, which is a semi-domesticated animal here in our lands, which is herded and cared for by us, by the Sami. During my time working with the protection of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions on an international level, and discussing these issues with governments, but especially when discussing it with other indigenous peoples from all over the world, I learned that we have such different prerequisites for how we can protect our cultural expressions. We have our own rules of how our expressions can be used. We have different needs, perhaps financial or cultural needs on the use of our cultural expressions. And we also have different wishes of how we would like our expressions to be used, both now and in the future. I can say there are many examples of misappropriation and misuse of Sami cultural expressions. But in all of these situations, there is one thing that these situations have in common, is that no one asked us if they could use our cultural expressions. Indigenous peoples, we do have our rights over our own intellectual property, as stated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You can see an extract here on the screen. Also here in the declaration, you will find the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, a principle that can, let's say, can guide interactions with indigenous peoples. For the fashion industry, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, well, would be understood as before you use cultural expressions belonging to an indigenous peoples, ask for their permission or their consent. Do not use threats, violence, or any kind of lies to get your way, let's say, and make sure you properly inform them about what you would like to use, how you would like to use it, etc. It's very important also to mention that if you as a company within the fashion industry reach out to an indigenous peoples, ask their consent using this principle of free, prior, and informed consent, putting in the hard work in good faith, let's say, the people then have a chance to say yes to future collaborations and so on, but they also always have the right to say no. Because as we can see, it's the indigenous peoples that has the right to maintain, to control, protect, and to develop their own intellectual property in the way that they find best. Now we can take the next slide. For me, I would say that expressions that are sprung from someone's culture, they cannot be treated the same way as other fashion, say. Traditional cultural expressions are many times deeply connected to identity, well, to traditional lands, to our customary laws, and to the history of the indigenous peoples. Take the gapta, our traditional clothes, as one example. It's an identity marker. You might see here on the screen that they all look different depending on where you're from. The design of my gapta tells the story of the area that I'm from, the family I have generations back, my marital status, and much more. Generations of Sami, they have contributed to the involvement of the designs. And using the gapta has led to many people being bullied and harassed. The Swedish state, for example, has used the gapta in discriminating and segregating policies. And now it's a symbol of great pride among the Sami. So therefore, this cannot be treated as any other piece of clothing. It's not just another design to be inspired by or for anyone to just use as they wish. It really needs to be treated with respect concerning its cultural significance. This goes for the gapta, but it goes for a lot of cultural expressions. And with those words, I'll just finish my short presentation of how important the protection of and the respect for our cultural expressions is to me as an Indigenous person. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the following discussions. So thank you, Keito.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for bringing this unique insight, for taking us a bit through international documents that explicitly talk about the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people, ethnic groups, and local communities when it comes to their own heritage. These are we are trying to break here the false assumptions that traditional cultural expressions are part of the public domain, and look at the broader and the bigger picture, bringing equality in the intellectual property space, if we can say like that. Important to give, to underline as well that traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, as we said at the beginning, are intimately tied with the rights of nature. Traditional knowledge includes a lot of wisdom and important information on how to protect the environment, how to ensure that the use of resources is nurturing the continuation of these cycles and not depleting the earth of its resources. Indigenous people and local communities have a different relationship to nature, a communion with nature that is lacking massively in contemporary society. This kind of awareness is lacking in the fashion industry today, and we are trying to bring it back. So to learn more about this communion with nature, we will talk to Ritu in Assam. At some point, Ritu will be also playing a soundless movie. So it's not a technical glitch. While he's taking us to the journey of Seven Weaves and through the jungles of Assam, we will also have a visual journey at the same time as listening to him. So Rituraj, the floor is now yours. Ritu, we'll have to unmute you. Fantastic.
I'm audible now. Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Fashion Revelation and CIPRI, for giving us this opportunity to put our views here. Rebecca, Tara, hello, and thank you for the wonderful, initial beginning of the whole thing. I'm Rituraj, and I am working in the Indo-Burma region of Assam, and which is an experiment. What we are doing is an experiment to understand the right of nature and how indigenous communities, the Rava communities who live here, and their cultural continuity can protect the Earth's fragile biodiversity. So this is what actually our small experiment is trying to do. We started this project 3 years back in April of 2017. And actually we wrote a business plan while we were in Berlin, and with two of my colleagues, Mandakini and Uma, and we came back to Assam to see, how this pristine forest of this region can be saved. The idea when we wrote the business plan in Berlin was that the indigenous people who are living in the forest villages need an alternative source of livelihood. Because their dependency is so deep, and that it is the probably cause of concern, and this dependency has to be diverted, and their alternative livelihood has to be involved, to provide it. So we came here. We thought we replicate the Bangladesh model, because Bangladesh is not very far away from here. So we bought the Bangladesh model in mind. We thought we'll teach the indigenous people how to sew in a sewing machine, and then connect with the fashion world, because if they can be connected, the fashion world will also have a beautiful solution, because these products will be produced in facilities which will protect the environment. So the fashion world can go to their customer and say, yes, see, we protect the forest of Assam, because everything, whatever is being made is made by the people who were dependent on the forest, and we have moved them out. So we came back, and we started this project. But as we started this project and we were started, conversation with the people, the Rava community. We went deeper and deeper. We learned, the things with which we thought and with which we came are very different from what actually is going on. We found that the Rava community in these villages, are having a very beautiful history of eri silk production, and that eri silk textile production still continues. It is still there. And also, like when we started developing deeper relations with the people, trying to understand how we start, how we do, we found out that like the relation is like there is a strong cultural relationship between the communities. And this cultural communities, like the relation, is not restricted to only some life forms. It is in the cultural community, like communities and the forest, the plants, the animals, the entire process of making the fabric out of it, and how, in spite of all of use of these resources, the land still have the elephants, roaming free in this area, and you wake up every morning with the sound of gibbons in your backyard. So a circular, century-old circular model of material production was in place in this beautiful forest and within these people. And what they used to do, they used to take the discarded cocoons of the eri silk moth, and they make into fabrics out of it. And learning this process, learning and spending time with them, we found out actually they have one of the most sustainable cloth I have ever realized, or I could ever imagine with them. So we thought the thought which we had, the ideas with which we wrote the business plan has to change, and change is that the Rava community culture goes beyond material like motifs or weave design. Their cultural capital also include the knowledge of the land, the natural systems, the plants, the animals, the interconnection, the reciprocity between these people and the land. So in short, what we did, we said, okay, fine, let's start. So in the culture, like what we did, the 7 Ws, started small centers in the villages, and started working with this Rava community, engaging with them by trying to be part of them, facilitating their cultural sustainability of the indigenous communities, to continue. And this is what actually we are doing in these villages, and we're trying to see how this cultural continuity is lived.
Thank you so much, Ritu, for sharing your story and for emphasizing the importance of reciprocity between people and nature, and how it is important to nurture this relationship, to think of business models where we nurture this relationship, not taking the people out of their connection with nature, but actually supporting this connection to continue. This is what cultural sustainability enablement refers to. It's cultural continuity and integrating this age-old knowledge in contemporary society in the way that we create and consume. And I think now we are ready to move on to the moments you've been all waiting for, and this is the open debate, and we'll start the first part of this open debate with a tough question that we are ready to answer, and for which we want to invite you all to engage in comments by posting questions and comments in the comment section, and we will try to integrate your points as well, or answer to these questions now or later in the Q&A section. So what does the fashion industry do wrong? What are the pain points, the critique points that we want to bring forward? And what are the practical solutions that we propose for resolving them? Tara, could we start with you and telling us a bit more about the OMA experience with design plagiarism and the need to put emphasis on the fact that TCAs are not part of the public domain?
Thank you, Monica. Yes, I think this is an important question. To me, honestly, it's quite puzzling. Fashion companies, they work with highly skilled, handcrafted artisans in Europe, sometimes in their own ateliers or within Europe. I don't totally understand why it's so difficult for them to make the leap to working with artisans that are a little bit beyond that geographic construct. And so really, I think there's this question of why fashion designers haven't recognized that collaborating with traditional artisans in other parts of the world, in other contexts, could actually be a really great marketing opportunity for them, and which they could create really beautiful collections that also, are more sustainable, that celebrate traditional knowledge, that are more environmentally sensitive as well. One of the biggest issues I think the OMA had, and us as well, in examining the plagiarism of Max Mara, was the fact that they had taken these designs and digitally printed them onto cloth. So it was taking a handcrafted piece of work that takes, hours, days, months to create, and creating a textile that takes almost no work. It's almost photographically printed and copied. And a major problem with this is that it's then potentially robbing the OMA of the opportunity to earn income from their own designs as well. I mean, we work with the OMA on developing products that they can sell to the tourism market, to the fashion world, et cetera. But if their digitally printed designs are just out there now in the public domain to be copied again and again, potentially they're going to lose that opportunity for people to then work with them directly. And we're talking about the livelihoods here of people who are living in much, sort of poorer circumstances. So this is, really troubling. Thanks.
This is fantastic. It's a fantastic point to emphasize, Sarah. This kind of other facet of appropriation. So it's not just what we or the industry talks so much about, cultural appropriation and copying. It's not just the fact that it's copying, it's the cultural dilution that stems from replicating those designs with other techniques, not involving the communities. And it's about this selling something. The other facet of it is selling something as authentic, a product, handcrafted product, when in fact it isn't. Rebecca, you have a lot of experience with the Sami, with this other facet of the appropriation phenomenon as well. Would you like to share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I mentioned, we do have a lot of misappropriation situations. If you'd like me to maybe go through those examples. We have really obvious ones, like a couple of years back, there was a company that made Halloween costumes. That's one thing, maybe not in the fashion industry, let's say, that made Gapta looking outfits and saying, dress as a Sami for Halloween. That is an obvious misappropriation, let's say. But there are also so many other examples, like when an interior designer printed a weaving pattern onto textiles. And then we had a situation where our traditional clothing, our Gapta, was remade, let's say, and said that, oh, anyone can use this kind. It has obvious, it's obviously mixed with our Sami traditional clothing, but this is appreciation. This is a tribute to the Sami community. Anyone can wear it. And that's something I think is really important, that we were all the Sami communities, they really rose up and they were very offended by this. And they said that this is not a tribute, this is disrespectful. And I think that's something that's really interesting for the fashion industry to say like, what is appropriation, what is appreciation? And for me, it's obvious that the ones who should decide what is the indigenous people or the local communities themselves. So yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. Maybe here again, it's important to emphasize the right of the communities to say no, and the reason why the communities can say no is not just because they don't want these expressions to be used or to travel around the world to be appreciated by others. There are often extremely deep cultural significance associated with these motifs. Ritu, you were sharing in some previous discussions an example of how protective the communities in Assam are of certain traditional expressions that have a particular cultural significance. Would you like to share this example with us today?
Yes, Monica, certainly. It's like, Rebecca is very right in saying, like, each indigenous community express themselves with certain, motifs and colorways. And the dresses which we wear is not just, a fashion. It is something which has a tradition, which has a history. It has, connection with the people. Like, where, like your status in the society, what you have done, what your grandparents have done. So it is not just a single piece of, cloth which has some colors. So we have, a very, like we had a very recent experience. So we use something called gamusa, which is very, like, it's kind of a piece of identity for all Assamese, and we are very proud of it. Like, so when anybody comes to Assam, like, we greet with that. So when we go to prayers, we take it in our, with us. So, and we put our deity there. And there are many people around the world today, they use it to just so that, they love and have affection to us. Last 3 months back, we got, somebody like come from another place, and he said, like, the head of state of that place is very fond of, your product, and he want to, have a mat made out of that. So we went to the village. We had a very beautiful discussion with the community, because whatever we do, it is on consultation, because everything is in a community here. So we started a discussion about that, a very big opportunity for us, to create a mat out of it. But our people said, no, we cannot do it. We'll love to give a piece of cloth, which is, which he can put it like we do, and we'll be very proud of it. But this piece of cloth is not allowed, for anybody to stand on it, because it's something where we put our God to be. And for us, like when we give it to somebody, like that somebody is always considered as a God in these communities. Like a visitor is always a God. So it is that tradition which we have to maintain. And this is what actually I extend what Rebecca is saying. We here, are like working with people who has the right to say no. And that has to be respected, because that piece of cloth is not just a piece of something which is very beautiful. It is much more than that. It is the connection between us and the art, and that's more than that.
So what are the practical solutions then that the fashion industry could take today to prevent such situations from happening, to integrate this right to say no, to be mindful of the value of traditional cultural expressions, and avoid situations like the Max Oma to happen, or unfair commercial exploitation of traditional cultural expressions?
Can I jump in here to answer that, and also to follow on what Ritu said? Similarly with the Oma, about when they saw the pictures of the clothing made by Max Mara, because they created a number of dresses, skirts, blouses, jeans, I think several different types of women's clothing. One of the things they had a problem with was the fact that some of the motifs that they usually wear on their headscarf was actually put at the bottom of a dress near the feet. And we know in Asia, of course, that's not appropriate at all. And so that was their biggest problem. They actually, if that clothing, most of that clothing had been handmade, they actually would have thought it was quite interesting, and they would have been proud to have a collaborative part in it. But they would not have allowed that particular motif to be used where it was and placed where it was. And I think that's what Rebecca and Ritu are getting at, is that when Indigenous people and traditional communities have a seat at the table, they can make these rules known. But you simply don't know them if you don't talk to them. And so, you know, the 3 C's rule, I think, has been super useful for us to condense the message that you simply need to get consent from people. You need to talk to them. You know, if you want to use their designs, the answer is not necessarily going to be no, but you have to ask first, you know. And then the credit and the compensation, of course, comes after. But the first step is always in making sure that these communities are consulted in one way or another. And so in this case, whether it's that you can't use the textile at all, that it needs to be placed in a certain way, or you can do however you want with it, you know, you're not going to know that until you talk to the communities.
Yeah, just jumping in there as well, I think, yeah, just agreeing with Ritu and Tara as well, saying that, well, it doesn't mean that, you know, if you reach out as a fashion industry, like we have so many examples where after you have reached out and like done your proper research and made sure you understand the cultural significance, giving, as Tara said, like the Indigenous peoples a seat at the table, like you have really, let's say, like fruitful collaborations that benefits the fashion industry or like the fashion company and Indigenous peoples as well. So it's not like, you know, all Indigenous peoples are going to say no. It's just that you need to understand that they are the ones who has to be able to decide how it should be used. So yeah, no, it doesn't mean they're going to say no. It might be a really good collaboration, and there are many examples of this. So,
and there is also a question building up on the direction of best practices and the 3 C's rule. How do we compensate communities that are maybe not formally organized or that have a different type of organization? From your experiences working with communities that are organized in different ways, what would you suggest, dear panelists? Rebecca, I know, for example, the Sami have a very clear form of organization. If you would like to share how the Sami are organized.
No, we have really strong institutions. We have Sami parliaments in 3 of the countries where we reside, and we have a Sami council that is doing work in all the 4 countries. That is a really strong organizations, and they put a lot of time and effort into working with these questions, because we see that, you know, this issue is like increasing in importance because we see more and more misappropriations of our cultural expressions. So, but they work a lot of like on the policy level, nationally, internationally, regionally, to bring this question, to more policy levels, let's say. But on who to compensate and like how to have that discussion, it's really difficult. And if you look at the principle of free prior informed consent and the studies made by the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, for example, they have a study that, among many things, discusses like how do you find the right representatives in order to get the right consent, and therefore, of course, know who to compensate. So that is a really important thing to look at, like who do we reach out to? And that's maybe part of the research work that the fashion industry needs to do if they want to use a cultural expression.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think it is a challenge. For example, with the OMA, they didn't have a organized representative group per se. So part of our work, TAC as an advocate and a support organization, was helping them through that process, understanding why they might need something like that and how to go about it. So there is a certain amount of preliminary work that may be needed for some of these cultural intellectual property rights to really be recognized. Not all Indigenous people or not all traditional communities are as organized as the Sami are. But I do also believe that there are other ethnic groups and other artisan communities in which they have advocacy groups, they have civil society organizations that represent them, they have researchers that are working with them. Nobody lives in a complete vacuum. And so why they might not have a completely representative organization immediately, there are people to be able to dialogue with, but the fashion companies or designers or whoever wants to collaborate needs to make some effort in doing that research, you know, needs to seek those people out. And maybe you'll find out, okay, there's no one that I can be very sure that can give consent, and that's your answer. But in some cases, with a little bit of questioning and research and reaching out to people, you will find the appropriate people. So, but I think our biggest problem at the moment is that fashion companies aren't even taking that first step. They're not even trying to get the consent in the first place. So, but I do think this is also a call for advocacy groups, for communities themselves to organize themselves, to recognize that there is a risk of traditional designs being misappropriated. And this is one other reason, like political issues, in which why they might need to organize themselves.
And if it's not the communities themselves or necessarily a representative from the community themselves, you have organizations like Seven Weaves, for example, that is acting as a mediator, as a facilitator to bridge this gap or this distance between the community and the fashion industry, and creating the forms of collaboration. Ritu, could you tell us a bit about, because this is important in your experience, you have seen firsthand the clash of these two worlds, the world of the indigenous communities and the fashion world, and how trying to, how do we bring these worlds together in understanding that indigenous textile production rhythms are different, that there's a different relationship with textile production. And this is also something that is extremely important to have in mind, not to keep focus only on the idea of plagiarism, but this is also a form in which the fashion industry is going wrong about indigenous textile production.
Yeah, Monica, actually what has happened, we have started building what you call facility centers, because there has to be interaction between these two worlds. I don't say it's two worlds are very separate, but yeah, there is a distinct difference between the two worlds, how they perceive values. So these centers which we have created in the villages are actually the place where there is these interactions can happen. But what I have seen, I will not say the problem, but I will say what actually the issue with when the brands come and start working with the artisans. The perceived value is that these are workers, but actually they are not workers. You are working with artisans, and they are community. They are not artisans like just you can give a design and they will make for you. They are a community. Then they work here because of passion. And one other I feel like many times when we interact with brand, when they come to the centers where we are working, we are facilitating the interaction, this place of interaction, we see people come thinking that they are poor. It is not the case. These people, these artisans who work here are not poor. They are not marginalized. In fact, they are sharing their happiness with you. They come here because they are passionate about what they are doing. That is what the two worlds has to understand. So this is what something we have practically seen during these interactions in last 3 years, which we had with brands all over the world who come here, and also like the artisans which try to work together with them. But of course, it is not something like it is not happening. We are collaborating and things are happening because we have slowly understood that okay, collaboration is possible between these two worlds. Monica.
Collaboration is definitely possible between the two worlds when there is no more, not a mindset of competition and a bottom-down approach, if you want, having the feeling that the fashion industry is ordering products from the artisans, not seeing them from the traditional communities, not seeing them as equal. So focusing on equal partnership and seeing these communities as equal knowledge partners in this process of co-creation is a way to go forward. And when we do that, questions to questions that have been asked by the public as well. Who do we compensate? What is fair? How do we compensate? These answers come also from these discussions with the representatives, right? Like Ritu saying, Tara saying, Rebecca saying there are consultations going on, engaging in deep consultations, discussing what is fair to you, what would work for you. It does take more effort and patience from the fashion industry. It does change and definitely contradicts the concept of fast fashion. It is a slow, mindful fashion that has a holistic approach, taking into consideration the well-being of the people and the well-being of nature as well. Are there any other points that the panelists would like to make on these ideas, or are we ready to move on to the second section and focusing on the learning lessons that the fashion industry can take from Indigenous people, ethnic groups, and local communities and their relationship with nature? If so, we'll start with Rituraj again, and giving him the floor to share a bit about the practices of the Indigenous communities in Assam and how do they protect biodiversity. What can the fashion industry learn from these practices?
Thank you, Monica. Monica, I think let us travel back to that, to my place. Come here. Yeah, I will explain you actually what is going on. And from there, we'll try to take inference from actually what we need to learn. Let's not me learning, like telling you what to learn. Let me take you to that place. So what happens here? So there is a forest. It's a beautiful forest. It has a lake, and the people are living there, right? So there are the Rabha communities who are living there for like centuries, and they are part of this forest. And then what they do, they rear eri. What is eri? Eri is a silk, which I think these are the people who first, are the people who has used it in the art and make it into fabrics. Now, what has happened when we see what they are doing every day? We found out that these people, every household in these villages, are rearing eri in their home, and this rearing of eri needs some fodder plants to feed them every day. Now, when you feed them every day, you are dependent on some plants, and these plants are available within the village. Right? So both the man and the woman, take turns, and they feed these small worms. And every 21 days or 22 days, there is the eri cocoon which comes there, because these are the discarded nest of the eri moth which flies off. And then these eri cocoons are left. So they collect these eri cocoons, and these cocoons are collected and then used, they boil with alkali from plants, again something which is coming from their orchards, and then they make it into cakes. So once these cakes are produced, right, these women who are there in these villages, they will start hand spinning this into yarn. This is what happens, how these people are using eri in their daily life. Second, what we saw there, what you can see here in this Assam. See, you have a lot of natural dyes within the forest, which are grown naturally, which are there, right? And they have a tradition of using these natural dyes. There are other ingredients which are used for making this fabric, which are also available within this forest. So what they do, they collect all this, and then so somebody is collecting this natural dye, somebody is spinning the cocoons and making it into yarn, and there's also cocoon which are somebody is having extra cocoon in their home. There's surplus, a small surplus is available. All this is offered to the weaver. So there is the weaver, and who is the weaver? Every woman in this village is a weaver. So if you are a woman, you have to know how to weave. This is something like if you want to marry somebody, you have to be a weaver. Because they will ask you if you can cook or you and also can weave. So that is something everybody has to do, and everybody in their home there is a loom. So what we did when we started this interaction with these people, we said, okay, fine, let's sit together and try to understand how we extend it, right? And then we found out everything in the village is is on something called commonality. Like everybody is, everything is sharing. So we said, okay, fine, then let's do something like this. You come out of your home, like the artisan weavers, and we create small centers where you can come and work and weave. So this is what is happening in these villages for last 3 years. And these are the places where, we have created for that interactions to happen, for us and them. So these people take everything to these centers, the yarns, the natural dyes, and these artisan weavers make it into fabric, right? And in this process, what happens? A beautiful piece of cloth is coming out of these centers. So this is how the whole ecosystem is working, right? But now, what we learn from this? Right? So what happened, when we started this project, so we went there, we wanted to understand, how much we can produce. Because in the material world, we are always, in economics, we say, okay, how much is the economics of sale? If you are a businessman, you say, okay, how much this business can be scaled, how big you can be. So that's how investment will come. So we started asking them how much you can produce more. Right? Now the issue is they can produce as much these yarns are available within the forest or within that villages. Right? Now this yarn is now related to what? The yarn is now related to the cocoons. Right? So if X amount of 10 kg of yarn is available, it has to come from 15 kg of cocoons. So to have this 15 kg of cocoons, you need 25 trees to be there, right? So we went to the guys, and we asked them, okay, how many trees, how much land is available for you here to support us, to make it big? They said to us, no, there is no land available. Everything, all land has been taken. Okay, so the land is taken because they are forest, they are land for the gibbons, they are for lands for the elephants, they are lands for cultivations, they are land for living, they are land for grazing. So all the lands in these places are full. So there is no room for anything. Then we said, then what we do and how you grow it? He said, the land which is available within this is what is available to you, right? And this is what is, is all about. Then we actually started asking questions like, what actually is this? And we try to take inference from this, like what actually the learning is there from this experience, and from this way of thinking. So what we found out, like these people who are living there, are offering their land, which is within the land which is available. So they are saying that we will not allow any change of landforms. Okay, so no land will be now cleared or changed from being a forest to a place where you can put the fodder crops for the area. So it has to be within those ecosystems which are existing, right? Now, from this, I think we can infer that what sustainability should be and what sustainability is. Right? So what is sustainability? Sustainability is working within this biodiversity zone in such a way that you don't influence change in the landform. So whatever is possible to produce within these available landforms, which is as is today, is what is maximum you can produce. Right? So at Seven Weaves, when we say we are producing aerosilk fabric, the aerosilk production capacity is not growing exponentially, and it will not grow exponentially to the market demands. If tomorrow, all of Europe say, oh, we'll want to buy all your fabric and please make it, 100,000 pieces every month, we cannot do it. It is limited by a carrying capacity, and its carrying capacity is the carrying capacity of the land. And how do we define it? It is the land which is in current form, where everything exists as is. And Monica, I think this is the example of sustainability. This is the example of what we call cultural sustainability, right? And it's also what we need to continue. And in this continuity, I think we have all the answers. Right?
I can sort of add to that from what Ritu said. I mean, I think Seven Weaves does incredible work with a natural resource and really being in connection with the supply chain that's part of it. We are less involved in all of the material production in that way, but I think there was the discussion earlier of, slow fashion and kind of being in line with the production timelines of the communities. And I would also agree that part of this is just recognizing that the communities are going to self-regulate their production capacity, both in terms of materials, their time, their labor, et cetera, and the designs. And so, but it requires that fashion companies adapt themselves a little bit to the timeline of the producers in that way. So, you know, I don't think this is such a huge ask. I mean, people say, oh, well, they can't do that like Ritu was saying. I mean, we've also had that where fashion brands have come to us and said, we're going to need 10,000 units of this in 60 days, go. And we've said, well, sorry, that's just not how it works here. You know, I mean, this is village production. If it's rice farming season, people are not going to have the time to work all day long. So I think fashion companies adapting themselves a little to producers does require some mediation and communication. And it does require a little bit of a shifting in the brands recognizing how they can produce. And maybe these have to be lines that are produced in a different type of timeline than what they're used to. So it does take a little bit of patience and listening and learning.
Yeah, and in fact, you know, you are very right, Tara, because, you know, like everything, whatever is produced here is on season. Like the seasonality is very strong here. And, you know, if you want a sustainable piece, you have to understand what sustainability is. And sustainability is, you know, and demanding what is right, and, you know, and demanding not what you want.
Thank you so much for this input, both of you, Ritu and Tara. I think it's so important that we also shift this conversation of what happens, kind of where do we have to adapt practices in the fashion industry. It's not just about kind of borrowing aesthetics and commercializing cultural identity. It's so much about understanding how the natural rhythms of production globally work, and we have so much research. We had the Earth Day yesterday. We had a panel on this topic. There's so much research and debate on how can we change the cycles of production? How can we transition to a circular economy? We have to look at the knowledge of Indigenous people and local communities to learn these practices. These are culturally embedded sustainability practices, knowledge that is available out there. All we have to do is to be open and to reach out to learn from these communities. This is another way in which we can learn and collaborate as fashion industry with Indigenous and local communities. It's not only about marketing and branding and imagery, it's about literally changing the cycles of production, supply chains, looking at the supply chains and where we can modify. It's about these communities basically have a clear knowledge from the beginning of the season of what are the quantities of textile that can be produced. So it doesn't really matter what the numbers would say that the market wants. It matters what the planet can give. So these communities are custodians and stewards of planet Earth. And this is something, an important message that we have to bring across to the fashion industry, and to have this awareness that cultural sustainability is a direction to follow. I propose then to move on from here to the Q&A section. We have a lot of questions that have to do with appropriating designs, getting inspiration, the line between appropriation and inspiration. And it's amazing that you have these questions. I just want to point out that you can also think broader and wider and go beyond the plagiarism topic. But we will take an important question that I see here, and see who from the panel wants to address it. Someone says here, even when fashion works in an ethical way, it's contributing to monetizing and mercantilizing traditional knowledge in a capitalist world. Should this knowledge be kept away from the market? Who has the right and power to say yes or no to that? Who wants to take the question?
Yeah, I can start here. I think it goes together with another question I've seen, that like how do we avoid commercializing traditional cultural expressions, or how do we avoid cultural expressions to become someone said like fast fashion. That's again, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that we should try to avoid. I mean, again, it comes back to the indigenous peoples or the local communities themselves to say, you know, we do this super cool weaving things. We want to commercialize this. We want this to be spread all around the world. Is there a way that we can have our patterns not weaved, but maybe printed? Yeah, sure, great. I mean, it depends on what the indigenous peoples or local communities wants to do themselves. And again, we come back to that. It's their choice how they want to protect and develop their own cultural expressions. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just to jump in, I mean, a lot of these communities are already commercializing their designs and their work through their handcrafted products. At least in Laos, many of the ethnic minority communities are producing crafts in which they get a very important supplementable livelihood through sale of products to tourists. You know, hand loom woven products. Embroidered products, wood carvings, things like that. And so they're already trying to commercialize them to some extent, partnering with a brand to develop this further in a different way. I think a lot of communities would be open to that, but it's simply, again, like we said, it requires communicating with them to see how that might work.
Yeah, I will just jump into that, saying, like, in fact, the communities like where we are working, the Rava community here in Gopalgarh, they want to contribute, they want to collaborate. In fact, what actually we have understood from the whole thing is that see what they are offering you. They are offering you a very sustainable way of doing things, right? And they are offering you a know-how of doing it, right? And when you see the fashion industry, what the fashion industry is, I think, is saying that they want to, do like, Karen group. I think he's here from Karen. He must be hearing it. So what your biodiversity agenda says, right? You are trying to create a piece of, high fashion fabric, high fashion war in the most biodiversified, respecting the biodiversity of the thing. And this is a perfect, place for collaboration. Why don't Karen, and the Rava community come together, co-create, co-develop, and produce a product, which is high fashion. This will not only actually, help, the fashion industry with the most sustainable clothes, or high fashion clothes they have, but the Rava community, because this will incentivize the cultural continuity there, because they are under pressure. These people, because we feel like, they are poor. That's what I'm saying. Like, when we think about the indigenous community, we always feel, they are staying in a remote village. They are very poor. No, they are not. But the definition of poor is actually also creating problem to them. So a collaboration is, very much needed, to be very honest, from the fashion industry. And then this fashion, collaboration will actually, help this cultural continuity. That's what actually I have understood from the last 3 years of my work.
It's a very important point, Ritu, and I think a lot when we talk about the luxury fashion industry, for example, what is being created in these communities is luxury product, because it is rare, it is unique, it has so much knowledge, cultural significance, meaning attached to it. This is true luxury textile. Let's not call it fashion, we call it textile, because textile is at the basis of everything here. So it's luxury textile, and creating collaborations between what we call today luxury fashion companies and these communities would be an amazing direction for the fashion industry to take, to also create good, to enable cultural survival, to enable cultural continuity, to maintain these pockets of healthy living, these healthy communities to thrive. This would be the win-win situation kind of, if we look at the issue holistically, we are trying to reduce overconsumption. This is a great way to reduce overconsumption. If you ask probably anyone who owns a piece of Seven Weaves cloth or a garment from the Oma or from the Sami, or like I cherish my Romanian blouses, like the connection with these items, it's a long-term, life-lasting connection, and kind of building upon or creating let's say, more learning opportunities for the audiences and for the consumers to learn about these communities, to interact with these communities, if these communities want. So the fashion industry can definitely contribute and do that. There are many questions here. Now I would like to transition a bit. There are many questions here about how can Indigenous people, local groups, ethnic groups respond to cultural appropriation cases. What can they do to protect their intellectual and cultural intellectual property? What would we have to say to that? Maybe we start with Tara.
Thank you, Monica. Well, just having worked with the Oma who were in this situation, so in 2019, as you saw in the video, they were plagiarized by Max Mara. And, you know, we were on a very steep learning curve, learning what happened here and was it wrong, you know, was there any legal recourse, et cetera. And, you know, we tried to use the court of public opinion. You know, that's why we started an online campaign to try to call out Max Mara, explain to them, maybe you made a mistake here. Maybe you had a lazy designer who just decided to copy. And, but we are here to tell you, look at this documentation, these belong to the Oma. And there was a lot of public pressure. It was a successful campaign, but ultimately it didn't result in an apology. It didn't result in any admission of wrongdoing, any compensation, or pledge to do better. And this is a problem, but this is also, as I said in my introduction, partially because a lot of times companies will only do what is legally necessary, and currently there aren't those strong legal protections for traditional cultural expressions. So this database model that TAC developed together with the Oma as well as CIPRI, this is an effort to sort of rectify that. This is a first step towards trying to help communities take ownership and sort of stake a claim to their cultural intellectual property. So creating this database is a complex process. It requires, you know, a lot of consultations, as we were discussing earlier, helping them, or if they already have a representative organization, dealing with this representative organization, getting free prior informed consent, doing a lot of the research, compiling this information, but this documentation kind of helps to provide this defensive evidence that that these techniques, you know, are widely practiced in this community. How do they have cultural significance for this community? They're used during funerals, they're used during weddings, they're passed on from grandmother to mother to daughter. And that helps to provide some body of evidence in the case that they are misappropriated. It then does require, we are working with the Department of Intellectual Property here to have that more legally enshrined in Lao law. But so there are a lot of different steps, and we're kind of in the first couple of steps. You know, with this database model that we've developed with CIPRI, we're hoping that this will be something that can be replicated in other countries of ASEAN, potentially worldwide. You know, Rebecca and Monica are the legal experts, so they know a little bit better in each country. I know it's a little bit different, but this is a first step towards communities saying we're organized ourselves, we've identified what our cultural expressions are and what they look like, and we are saying that they are ours, and that if you want to use these, you need to ask our consent. So I would encourage this as a first step for these communities.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in there, Monica, if that's okay. Yeah, I think that's such a good example of like what indigenous peoples or like what local communities can do themselves. Let's say what kind of responsibilities or what we ourselves can do. There's one way to do it. Another way is to what the Sami Council that I mentioned earlier is doing now is to develop collective marks, so that we ourselves can say like, we have decided that this is like proper handicraft made by an indigenous person or a Sami person, and it gets this collective mark. So that's well, it's a protection for us, but it's also like a consumer protection, because as we have mentioned before, like consumers do want to buy authentic products. Not all, but a lot of people do. They want to buy from authentic products. And I know that Ritu said, like, you know, not everyone, we shouldn't look at everyone from indigenous peoples or local communities as poor, but it's an important thing to say that indigenous peoples are amongst the poorest of the world. They're really in the like bottom there. So to take away their opportunity of income is also an extremely important issue to discuss. But again, I do want to just have a shout out to there's a lot of information on this World Intellectual Property Organization in their traditional knowledge division. They have produced a lot of publications on like how you yourself as an indigenous people or as a local community can protect. But I think again it's important to say that the responsibility falls on would fall on the fashion industry in this, but there are things that you can do yourself as well.
And there was also a mention about the geographical indication as a tool to help communities protect their handicrafts or non-agricultural traditional cultural expressions. The GI tag works in a couple of countries, but it is not recognized as a intellectual property protection tool everywhere around the world. So we get there in a bit more complicated debate. There are indeed ways that indigenous and local communities that are organized, very well organized and have representation, can register trademarks. They can even, artists from these communities could get their work copyrighted. But what is not recognized at the moment is this idea of a collective right that ensures protection for an indefinite period of time. And it's a right that gives this protection to indigenous people and local communities because they have been kept this knowledge alive for centuries, not because they create something new, which is the premise of the intellectual property protection system. And the model that we developed together with TAC and the Oma of Nanam village in Laos has been one of these attempts to create a positive protection system bottom up. So starting from a community that says we want our own unique rights, of course, complemented with intellectual property tools available there, a cohesive protection system can be put in place, but we need, and these communities need the support of the fashion industry. They need to have the fashion industry as allies, not as the counterparts that are stealing from them. And kind of this is the message on legal protection that we hope to share across today. A last question for the open debate. I think a beautiful question here where I hope that all the panelists, and I'm sure that all the panelists have great input to contribute. This question reads like this: how can we most respectfully facilitate the sharing of stories and knowledge by indigenous communities and encourage brands to learn about and in turn revalue their traditional textile practices? So how can we encourage brands to be mindful and to develop collaborations that value traditional textile practices?
Can I? Actually, what I have seen, like this is actually this is what actually the new consumer is, thanks to fashion revolution and people like you, that the consumer now demands transparency, right, in every product it takes. So, the brands can actually go to the last mile. Like when you buy something from Seven Weaves, you actually know the farmer. And this is not Seven Weaves alone. There are, like if you do something with Tara, you do something with Rebecca, we all can do it because we know what we are doing, who is doing it, how they are doing it. And there is a full appreciation of what everything is there. So I think it is, it is time, to tell the story of the both world together, and that is what is actually, is the valued product today. So I think, thanks to Fashion Revelation, thanks to those people out there who has started this ethical fashion initiative, that this is now becoming reality, and fashion can tell the story, and we can be proud of that. We can be proud and part of it.
Yes, I would second that sentiment of Ritu. It does take time. I think that, and I think I've said that several times in this session, but unfortunately, it does mean to some extent fashion can't work the way it's always worked in order to be more sustainable, to be more mindful of the intellectual property of traditional communities. It doesn't mean that you can just search online, get inspired by some piece of fabric that you have in your archives and decide to create something. It does require an investment of time, of potentially money, of human resources to research this, to really understand it, and to potentially meet producers and understand who is making our clothes or who's making our fabrics. But if I think it takes probably less time than they think. So once they start doing it, I think it is it's possible for them to continue doing it. They just need to take this first step. And one first step, and one opportunity, like Ritu said, is reaching out to advocacy groups or social enterprises, et cetera, that are already working with these producers. There's a whole host of different ways in which brands, I think, can work with communities if they just do a little research and find out more.
Yeah, absolutely agree with both Ritu and Tara here. But I also think how to encourage brand to learn about our traditional knowledge and our expressions or our cultures. I think we need to create the space to discuss these issues. I think that the fashion industry, as the ones who would have more financial resources or resources at all, I would love to see that they would encourage and they would create the space and the rooms to discuss these issues on more, well, on other levels than just to react when the damage is already done, and to just react in each and every case. We need to discuss this on a higher level. I would love to see that we reached agreements between indigenous peoples, local communities, and the fashion industry, where we agree on how do we deal with these issues. But we need to create those spaces, and that those spaces could be a place to discuss regulations and agreements, but it could also be a place to discuss what is traditional knowledge, how do we feel about our cultural expressions. I would love to see that space. So
one other thing I want to kind of jump in and say is, which I think we've all discussed, not on this session but beforehand, however, is the need for policy change and for governments to take a stronger role in this. We've seen a couple of different governments who have gotten more active in this space, recognizing that they need to protect the intellectual property of communities within their borders, understanding that a lot of these communities are transnational. But it's also a call for governments to recognize this as a resource, and the intellectual property of those communities, and that they need to assist those communities in protecting them.
So many good points, so many excellent resources have been thrown on the table today. If we were to kind of summarize these ideas, it would be, from this conversation, it would be reach out to advocacy groups, to entities like TAC, to projects like Seven Weaves, to practitioners like Rebecca, to CIPRI, reach out to the people that are in contact with the issues of Indigenous people, local communities, ethnic groups, because like this we can create spaces for discussion, spaces for co-creation. Ask your governments, ask your representatives what is being done in your country to protect the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. And it's not only, not Indigenous people don't exist in all countries, but there are definitely elements of cultural identity that should be kept alive. Knowledge in any parts of the world that is relevant to how we see the future of fashion today. Our time is getting up in a discussion that I would have loved to keep on going, and we will keep it going. Stay tuned on our platforms. We are sharing here the personal contact details of all the panelists, but make sure to check the platforms, the Seven Weaves website, the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center website, the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative website. We will surely plan to have more discussions with these panelists about what can be done and how can we contribute to creating these spaces of co-creation. Before we close, though, I would like to give the floor one more time to each panelist to send their message. We are revolutionaries. It's a revolution time. What is your message for the fashion industry to do today? Let's start with Tara.
Putting me on the spot. Well, I think I would say basically what I put in my last slide of my presentation. I would encourage fashion companies to reach out, to recognize traditional artisans that are operating in non-Western or developing country contexts, to recognize them as skilled, highly valued creators, and to partner with them.
Rebecca?
Yes. Well, I would encourage the fashion industry to just treat Indigenous peoples and local communities, cultures and their expressions with the respect that it deserves, and doing so by like deepening your own cultural understanding. And I would love to see a commitment from the fashion industry of like developing agreements and regulation in collaboration with Indigenous peoples and with local communities. That's something I would love to see. So
that is amazing. And Rituraj, your message at a revolution time.
It's a revolution time, and I think I take it very positive because I feel fashion has a lot of influence. It can influence, and we have seen the influence. It's very big. So if fashion decides to positively influence, like, and I can tell you, like if somebody from this fashion industry collaborate with Indigenous community respectfully, right? And this collaboration can brings things, because these will impact their cultural continuity. And if that cultural continuity is impacted, we can see a very beautiful world. So fashion industry, you are very powerful. Influence it, influence the cultural continuity, and we have a very beautiful world to see. Thank you.
Such an amazing panel. Thank you so much, Tara, Rebecca, and Rituraj, for being here today and representing the amazing communities that you come from and that you legally represent. Thank you to the Fashion Revolution team for inviting us to host this event. Thank you to Ruth, Jenny, and Emily in particular for having been constant support throughout the process. To the CIPRI team, Monica Parra, Shirvani, and Nicole. Thank you, the entire audience. Thank you, Ursula and Carrie, for having spotted Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative as a good collaborator for this year and hopefully for the years to come. Thank you all very much, and keep sending your questions.